In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford University student named Elizabeth Holmes had what she believed was a revolutionary idea. After watching her grandfather struggle with multiple needle sticks during medical treatments, Holmes envisioned a world where comprehensive blood testing could be performed using just a single drop of blood from a finger prick. She dropped out of Stanford after her sophomore year, using her tuition money to found a company called Real-Time Cures, later renamed Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. Holmes promised to democratize healthcare by making blood testing faster, cheaper, and less invasive than traditional methods. What followed was one of the most elaborate and devastating frauds in Silicon Valley history, a deception so complete that it fooled seasoned investors, respected board members, prominent politicians, and even experienced journalists for over a decade. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9.4 billion, making Holmes the youngest female billionaire on paper. But beneath the carefully crafted public image and revolutionary promises lay a company built entirely on lies, fake demonstrations, and technology that simply didn't work. Elizabeth Holmes possessed an almost supernatural ability to convince people of her vision, despite having virtually no background in medicine, chemistry, or laboratory science. She cultivated an image of brilliance and dedication, wearing black turtlenecks in homage to Steve Jobs, and speaking in an unnaturally deep voice that former colleagues later revealed was deliberately adopted to sound more authoritative. Her pitch was seductive in its simplicity. Traditional blood tests required large vials of blood drawn through painful venipuncture and took days to process through centralized laboratories. Theranos would change everything with proprietary technology that could run hundreds of tests on a tiny sample of blood from a fingerstick, delivering results in hours rather than days. The company claimed their revolutionary machines, which Holmes dubbed Edison devices, could detect everything from diabetes and high cholesterol to complex genetic markers and infectious diseases using sample volumes 50 to 1,000 times smaller than conventional methods. This wasn't just an incremental improvement, Holmes argued. It was a complete paradigm shift that would make preventive medicine accessible to everyone, potentially saving millions of lives by catching diseases in their earliest stages. Holmes proved remarkably adept at assembling an impressive cast of supporters who lent credibility to her claims without actually understanding the science behind them. Her board of directors read like a who's who of American political and military leadership, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Wells Fargo CEO Dick Kovacevic, and former Bechtel Group CEO Riley Bechtel. The company raised over $900 million from investors including the Walton family, Betsy DeVos, Rupert Murdoch, and venture capital firms like Partner Fund Management and Fortress Investment Group. These investors were drawn not just by Holmes's charismatic presentations, but by the seemingly endless market opportunity. The global laboratory testing market was worth over $150 billion annually. Holmes also cultivated relationships with major pharmacy chains, signing a partnership with Walgreens in 2013 to install Theranos wellness centers in stores across Arizona and California, with plans for nationwide expansion. The company's board and investor list was so prestigious that it created a self-reinforcing cycle of credibility, where each new high-profile supporter made it easier to convince the next one. The reality inside Theranos was far different from the revolutionary image projected to the outside world. The company's much-vaunted Edison machines were plagued with fundamental problems that made accurate testing impossible. The devices couldn't reliably process the tiny blood samples that were central to Theranos' value proposition, producing wildly inconsistent results that varied dramatically between runs of the same sample. Instead of acknowledging these limitations and working to solve them, Holmes and her leadership team, including President and COO Ramesh Sunny Balwani, chose deception. They secretly diluted the tiny finger prick samples to create enough volume for testing, a process that introduced significant errors and made many results meaningless. Even worse, the vast majority of Theranos tests were actually performed on traditional machines purchased from other companies like Siemens, with results manipulated by proprietary software to hide the fact that they weren't using revolutionary technology at all. When investors, board members, or potential partners visited Theranos facilities for demonstrations, employees staged elaborate theatrical performances using fake software interfaces and predetermined results to simulate the Edison machines working properly. Some demonstrations used blood samples that had been tested hours or days earlier on conventional machines, with employees simply displaying the pre-obtained results as if they had been generated in real time by Theranos technology. The human cost of Theranos' deception extended far beyond disappointed investors to real patients who received inaccurate medical information that could have endangered their lives. Between 2013 and 2016, Theranos performed hundreds of thousands of blood tests for patients at Walgreens locations and through direct partnerships with healthcare providers. Many of these tests produced results that were significantly different from what patients would have received from legitimate laboratories, potentially leading to misdiagnoses, unnecessary treatments, or failure to detect serious medical conditions. The company's quality control processes were virtually non-existent, with some employees later testifying that they were instructed to report results even when they knew the machines had malfunctioned or the samples had been contaminated. Theranos also failed to properly validate their tests according to standard medical protocols, skipping the rigorous clinical trials that would have revealed their technology's fundamental flaws. When concerned employees raised questions about patient safety or the accuracy of results, they were often fired or threatened with lawsuits. The company's legal team, led by the prestigious firm Williams & Connolly, sent intimidating cease and desist letters to former employees who attempted to speak out about what they had witnessed, creating a culture of fear that helped maintain the deception for years. The beginning of Theranos' downfall came from an unlikely source, a grandfather's concern for his grandson's career and integrity. Tyler Shultz, grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz, who served on Theranos' board, worked as a research engineer at the company in 2013 and 2014. The young Shultz became increasingly troubled by what he observed, including manipulated quality control data, unreliable test results, and a pervasive culture of secrecy that seemed designed to hide problems rather than solve them. When Tyler attempted to raise concerns internally and with his grandfather, he was met with dismissal and legal threats from the company. Frustrated and concerned about patient safety, Shultz became a whistleblower, eventually connecting with John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal who had begun looking into Theranos after receiving tips from other concerned sources. Carreyrou spent months investigating the company, interviewing dozens of former employees and reviewing internal documents that revealed the gap between Theranos' public claims and internal reality. In October 2015, Carreyrou published his first exposé, revealing that Theranos was secretly using traditional machines for most tests and that employees had serious concerns about the accuracy and reliability of results. The Wall Street Journal investigation triggered a cascade of scrutiny from regulators, investors, and medical professionals that quickly unraveled the entire Theranos fraud. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted inspections of Theranos laboratories and found serious deficiencies that posed immediate jeopardy to patient safety, including inadequate quality control, improper personnel qualifications, and failure to follow standard laboratory procedures. The Food and Drug Administration, which had been working with Theranos on approving their technology, discovered that many of the company's claims about FDA approval were false or misleading. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into whether Theranos had misled investors about its technology and business prospects. As regulatory pressure mounted, major partners began severing their relationships with the company. Walgreens terminated its partnership and sued for breach of contract, eventually settling for $140 million. The prestigious Cleveland Clinic, which had been collaborating with Theranos on research projects, ended its relationship with the company. Theranos was forced to void tens of thousands of blood test results and offer corrected reports to patients, an unprecedented admission of failure in the medical testing industry. By 2016, the $9.4 billion valuation that had made Elizabeth Holmes a billionaire on paper had become a cruel joke, as investors and analysts struggled to understand how they had been so completely deceived. Forbes, which had featured Holmes on its cover as the youngest self-made female billionaire, revised her net worth to zero, acknowledging that Theranos stock was essentially worthless. The company desperately attempted to salvage its reputation by pivoting to new products, including a miniature tabletop laboratory device they called the Mini Lab, but these efforts were too little and too late. Major investors who had poured hundreds of millions into the company found themselves holding worthless shares in what was increasingly recognized as an elaborate fraud. The prestigious law firm Williams & Connolly, which had helped Theranos intimidate whistleblowers and critics, distanced itself from the company as the legal implications became clear. In 2017, Theranos settled charges with the SEC without admitting wrongdoing, with Holmes agreeing to pay a $500,000 penalty, return her remaining shares to the company, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company. The settlement also required Theranos to raise new funding with enhanced oversight and disclosure requirements, but no legitimate investors were willing to put money into the discredited company. The criminal justice system's response to the Theranos fraud was swift and severe, reflecting the seriousness of endangering patients while defrauding investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. In June 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani were indicted on federal charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and wire fraud, with prosecutors alleging they had knowingly deceived investors, patients, and business partners about their technology's capabilities. The indictment detailed a complex scheme involving false demonstrations, manipulated test results, exaggerated claims about partnerships and revenue, and deliberate concealment of the technology's fundamental flaws. Holmes's trial, which began in 2021, became a media sensation as prosecutors presented evidence of the elaborate deception, including fake lab reports, staged demonstrations, and testimony from patients who had received inaccurate results. Holmes's defense team argued that she genuinely believed in her technology and had been manipulated by Balwani, her former romantic partner, whom they portrayed as the real mastermind behind the fraud. However, prosecutors presented evidence that Holmes was deeply involved in crafting misleading statements to investors and had personally approved many of the deceptive practices that sustained the fraud for over a decade. In January 2022, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud related to deceiving investors, though she was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients. The Theranos scandal fundamentally changed how Silicon Valley, investors, and the medical community evaluate breakthrough healthcare claims, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing innovation narratives over scientific rigor. Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison and ordered to pay over $900 million in restitution to the investors she defrauded, one of the harshest sentences ever imposed on a Silicon Valley executive. Ramesh Balwani was separately convicted on 12 counts of fraud and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison, reflecting his central role in perpetuating the deception. The scandal exposed critical weaknesses in how venture capital firms evaluate medical technology companies, with many investors admitting they had relied too heavily on Holmes's charisma and prestigious board members rather than conducting proper scientific due diligence. Medical professionals and laboratory scientists criticized the media and investment community for promoting a company that made claims that violated basic principles of chemistry and laboratory medicine, arguing that proper scientific review would have exposed the fraud much earlier. The case also highlighted the importance of protecting whistleblowers in healthcare, as several of the employees who tried to raise concerns faced legal intimidation and career consequences before eventually being vindicated. Today, Theranos serves as a mandatory case study in business schools, medical schools, and ethics programs, illustrating how charismatic leadership, prestigious associations, and compelling narratives can mask fundamental deception, and how the pursuit of revolutionary breakthroughs must never compromise scientific integrity or patient safety. The company that once promised to democratize healthcare by making blood testing as simple as a finger prick instead became a symbol of how Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it culture can have devastating consequences when applied to human health, leaving behind a legacy of betrayed trust, endangered patients, and billions of dollars in losses that continue to reverberate through the technology and medical industries.